The training ship Nexus Prime shook like a toy in the hands of an angry child as red warning lights flashed across every surface. Jake Martinez gripped his seat harness tighter as the metal groaned around him and sparks flew from control panels. Throughout the cabin, the ship was falling fast toward the yellow desert planet below, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Emergency landing protocols activated. The ship computer announced in its calm voice that seemed wrong for such a terrible moment. Jake looked around at his 3 alien classmates who sat in the other crash seats. Zeth was a Vorthan whose body looked like living crystal that caught and reflected light in beautiful patterns. His clear face showed no emotion, but Jake could see the worry in his bright blue eyes. Next to Zeth sat Kira, who belonged to the Aquarian race, and her smooth green skin was already starting to look dry in the ship's recycled air. Her large dark eyes blinked slowly as she watched the planet grow larger through the window. Jorik the Ursid filled his seat completely with his massive, furry body, and his bear-like face was calm, but his clawed hands gripped the armrests so hard they left marks in the metal. The 4 cadets had been together for 6 months at the Galactic Academy, where the best young minds from across the galaxy came to learn about space exploration and survival. Jake was the only human in their group and sometimes felt out of place among beings who were stronger and smarter than him in almost every way. Zeth could solve complex math problems in seconds, and his crystalline body could withstand radiation that would kill Jake instantly. Kira could hold her breath for hours, and her webbed hands made her incredibly fast in water. Jorik was strong, enough to bend steel bars, and his thick fur protected him from cold that would freeze a human solid dot. But now, as their ship fell toward the desert world, none of those abilities seemed to matter much. The engines had failed during what was supposed to be a simple training exercise in emergency procedures. They were meant to practice basic survival skills in a controlled environment, but something had gone wrong with the ship's power core, and now they were really going to crash on a planet that was not supposed to be dangerous, but was definitely not safe either. Impact in 30 seconds, the computer said, and Jake felt his stomach drop as the ship hit the planet's atmosphere and started to shake even harder. Through the window, he could see endless sand dunes stretching in every direction under 2 bright suns that made everything look harsh and unforgiving. There were no signs of water or plants or any kind of life that might help them survive. If they lived through the crash, the ship hit the ground with a sound like thunder, and Jake felt like every bone in his body was trying to break at once. Metal screamed and twisted around them as the Nexus Prime slid across the sand for what felt like forever, before finally coming to rest in a cloud of dust and smoke. For a long moment, nobody moved, and the only sound was the hiss of escaping air and the tick of cooling metal. Jake unbuckled his harness with shaking hands and stood up slowly to check if anything was broken. His head hurt and his left shoulder felt bruised, but otherwise he seemed okay. "Everyone alive?" he asked, and heard 3 different voices answer yes in their own languages before the translation devices kicked in and repeated it in standard Galactic speech. Zeth stood up, and his crystal body made small chiming sounds as pieces of him settled back into place after the impact. A few small cracks ran through his arm, but they seemed to be healing already as new crystal grew to fill the gaps. Kira was having more trouble, and Jake could see that her skin looked duller than usual, and small flakes were starting to peel off around her neck where her breathing slits were located. Jorik seemed fine physically, but his thick fur was standing up all over his body, which Jake had learned meant he was stressed or scared. "We need to assess our situation," Zeth said in his precise way of speaking that always made everything sound like a scientific report. "The ship appears to be completely disabled, and our communication systems are not responding to commands." Jake moved to one of the windows and looked outside at the alien landscape. The 2 suns were already lower in the sky than they had been. when they crashed, which meant several hours had passed while they were unconscious. The sand around their ship was fine and pale yellow, and stretched away in rolling dunes that seemed to go on forever. In the distance, he could see what looked like the bones of some huge creature sticking up from a dune like the ribs of an ancient. "Ship, the temperature outside is dropping rapidly," Kira said as she checked the environmental readings on a handheld device. "It was 45 degrees when we crashed, but now it is only 38 and falling fast. That is normal for desert planets," Jorik said in his deep, rumbling voice. "Without an atmosphere thick enough to hold heat, the surface temperature drops quickly when the sun set." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the falling temperature. He had grown up on Earth, where his ancestors had survived in deserts and frozen wastelands and burning forests by learning to adapt and build and fight against nature with nothing but their brains and hands. His alien friends came from worlds where technology had solved most problems, and their races had evolved to be perfect for their specific environments. But this planet was not their environment, and their technology was broken, and night was coming. Fast. "How cold will it get?" Jake asked, and saw Kira check her readings again with a worried expression. "The computer estimates it will reach -15 degrees before dawn," she said quietly. "And that is assuming no weather systems move through the area." Jake looked at his three friends and realized they were all thinking the same thing. Zeth's crystal body conducted heat very well, which made him comfortable in moderate temperatures, but also meant he would lose body heat quickly in the cold. Kira needed moisture to breathe properly, and the dry desert air was already making her sick. Jorik's fur would provide some protection, but his people came from a world with very stable temperatures, and his body was not designed for extreme changes. Ship groaned around them as the metal contracted in the cooling air, and Jake knew they did not have much time to figure out how to survive the night that was coming, whether they were ready or not. Jake watched his three alien friends as the temperature continued to drop, and he could see that they were all struggling in different ways. Zeth had moved away from the metal walls of the ship because his crystal body was conducting the cold. From the metal and making small crackling sounds as thermal stress built up inside him. The beautiful patterns of light that usually flowed through his transparent form were becoming dim and sluggish like a dying computer screen. Kira was having the worst time of all because her breathing slits were designed to filter moisture from the air, but the desert atmosphere was so dry that each breath was like swallowing sand. She kept touching her neck where the slits were located, and Jake could see small cracks forming in her green skin around the edges. Her large dark eyes were starting to look cloudy, and she moved slowly like everything hurt. Jorik seemed to be doing better than the other two because his thick fur provided natural insulation, but Jake noticed that the big alien was breathing hard, and his tongue was hanging out slightly. The Ursid homeworld had a stable climate that never changed much throughout the year, and Jorik's body was not equipped to handle rapid temperature swings. His fur was great for keeping heat in, but it also made it hard for him to cool down when he needed to, and now that the air was getting cold, his body was working overtime to maintain the right internal temperature. "We should try to repair the communication array," Zeth said, but his voice sounded different than usual and had a brittle quality like glass under stress. "If we can send a distress signal, the rescue ships will find us within 12 hours. The communication systems require power from the main core," Kira replied while checking another handheld device with shaking fingers. "All primary power is offline, and the backup systems are not designed to run the long-range transmitters." Jake left his friends to their technical discussion and moved to the emergency exit hatch at the back of the ship. The seal was broken from the crash, so he was able to push it open and step outside into the alien desert. The air hit him like a physical blow, and he could feel the cold seeping through his academy uniform already, but he forced himself to ignore the discomfort and focus on their surroundings. The landscape was even more desolate than it had looked. Through the ship's windows, sand stretched away in every direction under the pale light of the two suns that were sinking rapidly toward the horizon. The dunes shifted and flowed in patterns that reminded Jake of frozen ocean waves, and the only sound was the whisper of wind carrying sand across the empty spaces between the hills. But Jake was not looking at the endless emptiness because his human brain was trained by millions of years of evolution to spot the things that could be useful for survival. Near the ship, he could see several pieces of debris that had broken off during the crash, including metal panels and insulation materials that might be repurposed. More importantly, he could see the massive skeleton he had noticed earlier, and now that he was outside, he realized it was much larger than he had thought. The bones belonged to some kind of creature. That must have been the size of a blue whale when it was alive. The skeleton was partially buried in sand, but Jake could see huge rib bones that curved up from the dunes like the framework of a cathedral. The bones were bleached white by years under the twin suns and looked incredibly strong despite their age. Near the skeleton, Jake could also see smaller bones scattered around that belonged to different creatures, and all of them had been picked, cleaned by scavengers, and polished smooth by wind and sand. Jake knelt down and picked up a handful of sand to examine it more closely. Most of it was fine quartz particles that would not hold together well, but mixed in with the sand he found clay and other minerals that could be useful. In some areas, the sand was packed hard by wind and looked almost like concrete, while in other places it was soft and loose. His human ancestors had learned to work with materials like this thousands of years ago, and Jake found himself remembering things he had learned in school about ancient construction techniques. The wind was getting stronger as the suns continued to set, and Jake could feel the temperature dropping noticeably with each gust. Soon it would be dark, and the real cold would begin, and his alien friends would start to die from exposure, because their bodies were not designed for this kind of environmental stress. Their races had conquered the challenges of their homeworlds through technology and genetic adaptation, but they had never needed to learn the basic survival skills that humans took for granted. Jake walked back toward the ship, but stopped to examine some of the crashed debris more carefully. There were sheets of metal that could be shaped into tools or reflectors, and pieces of insulation that could help trap heat. The ship's emergency supplies would provide some food and water, but not much protection from the cold night that was coming. Inside the ship, he found his three friends, still working with their devices and trying to find a technological solution to their problem. Zeth was using his internal computing abilities to run diagnostics on every system, while Kira checked environmental readings, and Jorik tried to manually restart various pieces of equipment. All of their efforts were focused on getting their advanced technology working again, because that was how their civilization solved problems. "Any luck with the repairs?" Jake asked, and saw three heads shake in defeat. "The damage is too extensive," Zeth replied, and his voice had the brittle quality again. "Without proper tools and replacement parts, we cannot restore power to the communication systems. The rescue protocols require us to remain with the ship," Kira added weakly. "Standard procedure is to activate emergency beacons and wait for recovery teams to locate us." "The emergency beacons are not functioning," Jorik said with frustration evident in his deep voice. "We are essentially invisible to any search efforts until we can restore primary power." Jake looked at his friends and realized they were thinking like members of advanced civilizations who had always been able to rely on technology to solve their problems. But technology had failed them, and now they needed something older and more basic than computers or machines. They needed the kind of knowledge that humans had developed when they were still living in caves and fighting to survive against a hostile natural world. "How long until full darkness?" Jake asked, and watched Kira check her instruments one more time. "Less than 2 hours," she said quietly. "And the temperature is expected to reach dangerous levels within 4 hours after sunset." Jake nodded and began planning what he needed to do, because waiting for rescue was not an option when his friends would be dead before morning if they stayed inside the broken ship without heat or proper shelter from the cold desert night that was coming for them all. Jake stepped back outside into the cooling desert air and began walking toward the massive skeleton that dominated the landscape near their crashed ship. The two suns were hanging low on the horizon now and cast long shadows across the sand dunes, while the wind carried a sharp bite that promised much colder temperatures ahead. His alien friends were still inside the ship, trying to make their broken technology work, but Jake knew that was not going to save them when the real cold arrived. The huge skeleton belonged to some kind of predator that had lived on this planet long ago, and Jake could see from the shape of the skull that it had been built for hunting. The creature must have been 30 meters long when it was alive, and its bones were thick and strong like the framework of a building. Jake ran his hands along one of the massive rib bones and felt how solid it was, despite being exposed to wind and sand for years or maybe decades. What made the bones perfect for his purposes was that they were hollow, like bird bones, but much stronger. The hollow spaces would provide natural insulation, while the bone material itself was incredibly durable. Jake had learned about similar techniques in his Earth history classes where ancient humans had used mammoth bones to build shelters during ice ages. The principle was the same, even though the scale was much larger. Jake began selecting the best bones from the scattered remains around the main skeleton. He chose long, straight pieces that could serve as support beams and curved sections that would help distribute weight evenly. The smaller bones from other creatures would be useful for filling gaps and creating joints between the larger pieces. As he worked, Jake felt something awakening in his mind that connected him to thousands of generations of human ancestors who had faced similar challenges with nothing but their intelligence and determination. The sand around the skeleton was different from the loose material near the ship, and Jake quickly realized why. Over time, the bones had created a microenvironment where clay particles and minerals had settled and mixed with the regular sand to create a substance that was much more useful for construction. Jake scooped up handfuls of the mixture and tested its properties by adding small amounts of water from his emergency supply. When the mixture reached the right consistency, it became like natural concrete that could be shaped and molded and would harden as it dried. This was exactly what Jake needed to create walls that would hold heat and block wind. The ancient peoples of Earth had discovered similar techniques thousands of years ago, when they learned to mix clay and sand and straw to make adobe bricks that could withstand extreme weather. Jake began carrying bones back toward the crash site, while his mind worked through the design of the shelter he would build. It needed to be large enough for 4 people, but small enough that their body heat could warm the interior. The entrance should face away from the prevailing wind, and the walls should be thick enough to provide real insulation against the cold. Most importantly, it needed to be built quickly, because darkness was coming fast. Inside the ship, his 3 alien friends were growing more desperate as their attempts to repair the communication systems continued to fail. Jake could hear them talking through the open hatch, and their voices sounded strained and worried. Zeph's crystal body was making more crackling sounds as the temperature dropped, and Kira's breathing was becoming more labored as the dry air continued to damage her respiratory system. "Jake, what are you doing out there?" Jorek called from inside the ship, and Jake could hear confusion in the big alien's voice. "Building us a place to sleep tonight," Jake replied as he dragged another large bone into position near the ship where he planned to construct the shelter. "We have emergency blankets and heating units in the survival kit," Zeth said in his logical way. "Primitive construction is unnecessary when we have advanced materials designed for this purpose. Jake paused in his work and looked back at his friends through the hatch. The emergency blankets they were talking about were thin metallic sheets designed to reflect body heat back toward the user, but they would not provide any protection from wind or create an enclosed space that could be warmed effectively. The heating units were small chemical devices that would provide warmth for a few hours at most before their fuel ran out. Those things will help, but they won't keep us alive all night, Jake explained patiently. We need real shelter that can hold heat and block the wind and last until rescue comes. But you are using bones and sand, Kira said weakly from where she sat inside the ship. How can such basic materials provide better protection than our advanced survival equipment? Jake understood why his friends were confused, because their civilizations had moved beyond the need for primitive construction techniques centuries ago. They lived in climate-controlled environments where technology handled all the challenges of survival, and their education focused on operating complex systems rather than basic skills like building shelter or finding water. Sometimes the old ways work better than the new ways, Jake said as he continued positioning Bones to create the framework for his shelter. My people learned how to survive in places like this long before we had any advanced technology to help. U.S. Jake worked steadily as the sun sank lower in the sky and the air grew colder with each passing minute. He created a semicircular foundation using the largest bones as anchor points, and then began building up the walls using a combination of medium-sized bones and the sand-clay mixture he had discovered near the skeleton. The hollow bones provided excellent insulation, while the clay mixture filled gaps and created a solid barrier against wind. As Jake worked, he could feel his body remembering movements and techniques that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his genetic memory. His hands knew how to test the strength of a joint, and his eyes could judge the proper angle for load-bearing supports. This was knowledge that had been passed down through countless generations of humans who had survived by learning to work with whatever materials nature provided. The alien landscape around them was growing darker as the two suns approached the horizon, and Jake could see the first stars beginning to appear in the purple sky above. The temperature was dropping fast now, and he could hear his friends moving around inside the ship as they tried to stay warm with their emergency equipment. Jake stepped back to examine his work and felt satisfied with the progress he had made. The shelter was taking shape exactly as he had planned, and would soon provide the protection they all needed to survive the deadly cold of the desert night that was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. The two suns finally disappeared behind the sand dunes, and darkness fell across the desert like a heavy blanket as Jake put the finishing touches on his shelter. The temperature had already dropped below freezing, and he could see his breath forming clouds in the cold air as he worked by the light of a small emergency beacon. Inside the crashed ship, his three alien friends were huddled together under their emergency blankets, but Jake could hear their teeth chattering and see that they were shivering uncontrollably. "Jake, you need to come inside now," Zeph called out, and his voice sounded brittle and weak like breaking glass. "The shelter you are building cannot possibly provide adequate protection from these extreme conditions." But Jake ignored his friend's advice and continued working because he could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon where the suns had set. The wind was picking up and carrying sand that stung his face and hands as he carefully sealed the last gaps in his shelter walls. He had learned from studying Earth's desert peoples that sandstorms could be just as deadly as the cold because they could strip skin from bone and fill lungs with choking dust. The shelter Jake had built was roughly dome-shaped and about 4 meters across, with walls that were half a meter thick. The framework of large bones provided structural strength, while the smaller bones and sand clay mixture created a solid barrier against wind and cold. Near the top, he had left a small opening for smoke to escape, and at ground level, he had created an entrance tunnel that curved upward to prevent heat from escaping while keeping wind and sand from blowing inside. Jake gathered some pieces of metal, debris from the crashed ship, and arranged them in the center of the shelter to create a fire pit. Then he collected dried plant material that had blown against the bones over the years, along with some combustible materials from the ship's emergency supplies. Getting a fire started took several tries because his hands were getting numb from the cold, but finally small flames began to dance in the makeshift hearth. "Everyone needs to get in here right now," Jake shouted toward the ship as the first gusts of the approaching sandstorm reached them. "Bring the emergency supplies and anything else that might be useful. But hurry, because this storm is going to be bad." His 3 alien friends stumbled out of the ship, carrying their survival gear and emergency blankets, while the wind howled around them, and sand whipped through the air like tiny bullets. Zeth moved carefully, because his crystal body was becoming more brittle in the extreme cold, and several new cracks had appeared across his chest and arms. Kira was breathing in short gasps, and her green skin had turned a sickly gray color. Dehydration and cold stress overwhelmed her system. Jorik was the strongest of the 3, but even his thick fur could not protect him from the combination of freezing air, and driving sand. Jake helped his friends through the entrance tunnel and into the shelter where the small fire was already beginning to warm the enclosed space. The bone walls blocked the howling wind completely, and the thick construction meant that the interior temperature was noticeably warmer than the brutal cold outside. As soon as they were all inside, Jake sealed the entrance with a large flat bone and some of the clay mixture to create an airtight barrier. "This is impossible," Zeth said, as he felt the warmth beginning to penetrate his crystal structure and ease the thermal stress that had been building all day. Primitive materials should not be able to provide this level of environmental protection. Jake added more fuel to the fire and watched as the flames reflected off the smooth inner surfaces of the bone walls to create a warm, golden glow throughout the shelter. The fire pit was designed to burn efficiently without creating too much smoke, and the ventilation hole at the top drew the smoke away while preventing heat from escaping. These were techniques that human beings had perfected over thousands of years of surviving in hostile environments. Your people never had to learn this stuff, because you had technology to solve all your problems, Jake explained as he helped Kira position herself near the fire where the warm air could help her damaged breathing slits begin to heal. But my ancestors spent millions of years figuring out how to stay alive with nothing but rocks and sticks and fire. Outside, the storm was growing stronger, and they could hear sand and debris battering against the shelter walls. But the bone framework flexed with the wind instead of breaking, and the thick clay mixture absorbed the impact without cracking. Jake had designed the shelter to work with natural forces rather than fighting against them, and the curved shape deflected the wind around the structure, instead of creating resistance that could cause structural failure. Jorik was amazed at how quickly his body temperature returned to normal once he was protected from the wind and cold. His thick fur had been a liability in the open desert because it trapped cold air against his skin. But now in the enclosed space, it worked properly to insulate his body heat. "How did you know to build it this way?" he asked Jake with genuine curiosity in his deep voice. "I didn't really know," Jake admitted as he adjusted the fire to maintain steady heat without wasting fuel. "But humans have been building shelters like this for so long that it feels natural, even when you've never done it before." Kira was breathing more easily now that the air inside the shelter contained moisture from their respiration, and the fire created humidity that her damaged breathing slits desperately needed. The warm environment allowed her body to begin repairing the damage caused by the dry desert air, and her green skin was already starting to look healthier. "Your species fascinates me," she said quietly. "You appear to be physically inferior." to most galactic races, but you possess survival abilities that surpass our most advanced technologies. The storm raged outside with incredible fury, and they could hear the wind screaming across the desert, at speeds that would have been instantly fatal to anyone caught in the open. Sand and debris hammered against their shelter like machine gun. Fire, but the walls held firm, and the interior remained warm and safe. Jake monitored the fire carefully and added fuel as needed while his 3 alien friends experienced something their advanced civilizations had never taught them. They were learning what it meant to survive through human ingenuity and the ancient knowledge that had carried their species through ice ages and droughts and every other challenge that nature could devise to test the will to live. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the small ventilation hole at the top of Jake's shelter and woke him from a surprisingly peaceful sleep. The storm had finally passed sometime during the night, and the desert outside was quiet except for the gentle whisper of sand settling back into new patterns across the dunes. Jake carefully added the last of their fuel to the dying fire and looked around at his 3 alien friends, who were all sleeping comfortably for the first time. Since their ship had crashed, Zeth's crystal body had stopped making the brittle crackling sounds that had worried Jake so much the day before, and the cracks in his structure were healing as his internal temperature stabilized. The steady warmth from the shelter had prevented the thermal shock that could have shattered his crystalline form completely. Kira's breathing was deep and regular, now that the humid air inside the shelter had allowed her damaged breathing slits to repair themselves overnight. Her green skin had returned to its normal healthy color, and the gray patches of dehydration were completely gone. Jorik was snoring softly, and his thick fur was no longer standing up in stress patterns but lay flat and comfortable against his massive body. The stable temperature inside the shelter had allowed his metabolism to return to normal after the dangerous fluctuations caused by the extreme desert conditions. All 3 of his friends had survived the night that would certainly have killed them if they had remained in the crashed ship with only their advanced emergency equipment to protect them. Jake heard the distant sound of engines approaching across the desert and carefully unsealed the entrance to look outside. 3 sleek rescue ships were flying in formation toward their location, and Jake could see that they were equipped with the most advanced environmental suits and scanning equipment that galactic technology could provide. The rescue team had probably spent the entire night searching for the crashed training vessel, using sophisticated sensors and tracking systems. "Everyone wake up," Jake said quietly as he watched the rescue ships land near the wreckage of the Nexus Prime. "Our ride home is here." His 3 friends stirred awake and began gathering their belongings while Jake carefully extinguished the fire and prepared to leave the shelter that had saved their lives. As they crawled through the entrance tunnel and emerged into the bright morning sunlight, Jake could see the rescue team members staring at his primitive construction with expressions of amazement and confusion. The rescue team leader was a tall Centaurian with 4 arms and skin that shimmered like oil on water. She approached Jake and his friends while her team ran diagnostic scans on the crashed ship and checked for any other survivors. "Cadets, we have been searching for you since your emergency beacon failed to activate," she said in the formal tone used by Galactic Rescue Services. "How did you survive the night without proper environmental protection?" "Jake built us a shelter," Kira said simply as she gestured toward the dome of bones and clay that had protected them from the storm. "He used materials from the crash site and the surrounding area to create a structure that maintained livable conditions throughout the night." The rescue team leader looked at the shelter more carefully, and Jake could see her trying to understand how such primitive construction could have been effective against the harsh desert environment. She activated a handheld scanner and began taking readings from the bone walls and clay mixture while her team members gathered around to observe the unusual structure. The internal temperature reading shows 22 degrees, one of the team members reported with surprise in his voice. The external temperature reached -18 degrees during the storm, with wind speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour. That should have been instantly fatal to any unprotected biological forms, another team member added as she examined the entrance tunnel design. This shelter somehow maintained a temperature differential of 40 degrees, using nothing but organic materials and primitive construction techniques. Jake watched as the rescue team documented every detail of his shelter with their advanced scanning equipment and recording devices. They seemed fascinated by the way the bone framework had flexed with the wind instead of breaking, and how the clay mixture had expanded and contracted with temperature changes without developing cracks. The curved design that deflected wind and the ventilation system that maintained air quality while preserving heat were all principles that human engineers had learned through thousands of years of trial and error. "We need to take detailed scans of this structure," the team leader decided after consulting with her colleagues. "The survival techniques demonstrated here could be valuable for future training programs." As the rescue team continued their documentation, Jake found himself being interviewed by several different specialists who wanted to understand how he had known to build the shelter using such specific design principles. He tried to explain that the knowledge seemed to come naturally once he started working with the available materials, but the aliens had difficulty understanding concepts that were not based on formal education or technological systems. "Your species possesses remarkable adaptive capabilities," Zeth told Jake as they waited for the rescue ships to complete their preparation for departure. "I have been analyzing the mathematical principles behind your shelter design, and the engineering is actually quite sophisticated despite the primitive materials." "I never thought about the math," Jake replied honestly. "I just built what felt right based on what my ancestors would have done in the same situation." "That is exactly what makes it so impressive," Kira said as she breathed deeply of the clean desert air that no longer threatened her respiratory system. "Your people developed these survival instincts through millions of years of evolution and natural selection." Jorik nodded his massive head in agreement as he looked back at the shelter one more time before boarding the rescue ship. "My people have grown dependent on technology to solve all our problems, but you showed us that sometimes the oldest solutions are the most reliable ones." During the flight back to the Galactic Academy, Jake learned that news of their survival had already spread throughout the educational system and beyond. The rescue team had transmitted their initial reports and videos of the bone shelter to Academy administrators, who were amazed that primitive human construction techniques had outperformed advanced alien survival equipment. Within days, Jake found himself giving presentations to classes of alien cadets who wanted to learn about human survival methods and the evolutionary advantages that came from growing up on a world with diverse and challenging environments. The shelter itself was carefully disassembled and transported to the Academy, where it was reconstructed as a permanent exhibit in the Survival Training Center. Jake Martinez became the first human to receive the Galactic Survival Innovation Award, not for discovering new technology or developing advanced theories, but for demonstrating that the oldest human skills were still the most valuable ones when everything else failed and survival depended on nothing more than intelligence and determination, and the will to keep fighting against impossible odds.